The little black girl hid beneath the patrolled catwalk, asking the biker why her mom never returned last night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was a late night at the city carnival, a time when the crowds had begun to thin out, and the air smelled of cotton candy and hot dogs, with a slight chill creeping in from the evening breeze. The once bustling grounds of the carnival were now quieter, and the lights from the food stands flickered in the distance. Beneath the overhead catwalk, where security guards casually walked by, a little black girl crouched, her small frame trembling. Her eyes were wide with fear as she looked around, making sure no one saw her hiding. She could hear the distant sounds of laughter and music from the rides, but none of it comforted her. She didn't know where her mother was. It was late, too late for a little girl to be alone like this, and she couldn't stop the tears that kept falling down her cheeks. She had no choice. She needed help. As she peeked out from under the catwalk, her heart raced when she saw a group of bikers parked near the edge of the carnival grounds. The men, tough-looking with leather jackets and tattoos, stood talking among themselves, but the girl only had one focus. She mustered every ounce of courage she had left, and without thinking, she ran toward them. Her bare feet slapped against the cold concrete, and her chest ached with every step. When she reached the bikers, she grabbed the closest one by the sleeve of his leather vest, looking up with desperate eyes. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where's my mom? Why hasn't she come back? She didn't come home last night." The biker, startled at first by the sudden appearance of the frightened girl, looked down at her with a furrowed brow. His weathered face softened as he knelt down to her level. Hey, he said gently, "what happened? Where's your mom?" The girl could hardly speak, her body shaking with fear. She was supposed to come back last night, but she didn't. I tried calling her, but she didn't pick up." The biker looked around at his companions, exchanging glances. They didn't know what to make of this, but the urgency in the girl's voice was undeniable. Without a word, he stood up and motioned for the others to gather around. "We need to find out where she is," he said firmly. "You're safe now. We'll help you." The girl's heart pounded in her chest. For a brief moment, she thought she might finally have found someone who could help. She had no idea what was really going on, but as she looked into the biker's kind eyes, she felt a flicker of hope. The bikers, who had no idea what was about to unfold, knew one thing for sure. They couldn't leave this girl alone. The group began to gather their gear, the sound of their motorcycles rumbling to life as they prepared to go on a mission they never expected. Little did they know, they were about to uncover something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The bikers, with their engines still rumbling, quickly gathered around the girl. She stood frozen, her small body trembling as she looked up at them, tears still glistening on her cheeks. The leader of the group, a tall man with a gruff voice and a leather vest covered in patches, knelt down beside her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently, his voice softening as he noticed her fear. "Aisha," she whispered, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Aisha, we're going to help you," the biker said. "Where did you last see your mom?" Aisha hesitated, looking down at the ground. She was supposed to come back last night. She told me she would be home before midnight, but she didn't." The biker's face hardened as he glanced over at the rest of the group. He could tell that something wasn't right. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he assured her, standing up. "Stay with us, okay?" Aisha nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. The group of bikers quickly moved into action. The leader, who went by the name of Hawk, motioned for the others to follow him. They needed to act fast. Time was slipping away. "I'm going to call her," Hawk said, pulling out his phone and dialing Aisha's mother's number. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. "Come on, pick up," Hawk muttered under his breath. He looked at the other bikers. "Her mom's not answering. We need to check her place." The bikers immediately mounted their motorcycles, the sound of their engines echoing through the empty carnival grounds. The headlights cut through the darkness as they sped toward the neighborhood where Aisha lived. It was about a 20-minute ride. Aisha clung to Hawk's back, her small hands gripping his jacket as they raced through the streets. The wind whipped past them, but all she could think about was her mom. Where was she? Why hadn't she come back? As they rode, Aisha's mind raced with unanswered questions. The carnival felt like a distant memory now, the lights and sounds replaced with the silence of the night. It was cold, and Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her mother. We're getting closer, Hawk said over his shoulder, his voice steady but filled with concern. Stay with me, Aisha. Aisha nodded, squeezing her eyes shut for a moment, trying to block out the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The group pulled into the driveway of Aisha's home, the house dark and still. There were no lights on, no sign of her mother's car. Hawk dismounted his bike and walked toward the door, motioning for the others to stay back. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. No answer. He knocked again, this time harder, but still nothing. Maybe she's just sleeping, one of the bikers said, trying to sound reassuring. I don't think so, Hawk replied, his voice low. He pulled out a set of tools from his jacket and began to work on the door lock. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and Hawk stepped inside. The rest of the bikers followed, their heavy boots thudding on the wooden floors. The house was eerily quiet. The living room was cluttered with old furniture and empty pizza boxes, but there was no sign of Aisha's mother. Where is she? Aisha whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched onto Hawk's sleeve. We'll find her, Hawk reassured. Her. The bikers spread out, checking every room. It didn't take long before one of them called out from the back of the house. Hawk, you need to see this. Hawk's heart sank as he hurried to the back room. He pushed open the door to find the room in disarray. Furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered across the floor. But it was the bed that caught his attention. Aisha's mother was there, lying unconscious, her body pale and still. No, Aisha gasped, rushing toward the bed. Hawk quickly stepped forward, checking her pulse. She's alive, he said, his voice tight. But just barely. We need to get her help, now. The bikers worked quickly, lifting Aisha's mother gently and making their way outside. Hawk turned to Aisha, who was now crying quietly, her face full of fear and confusion. Aisha, we're going to get her to safety, he promised. You're not alone anymore. As the bikers carefully loaded Aisha's mother onto one of the bikes, they began to make plans to take her to the nearest hospital. But Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. Who did this? And why? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. They weren't leaving until they figured it out. As the bikers rushed to load Aisha's mother onto one of the motorcycles, the tension in the air was thick. Hawk kept a careful eye on the girl, making sure she was safe while the others prepared to leave. The engines roared to life, filling the quiet night with their power, but it felt like a distant hum in Aisha's ears. All she could think about was her mom. She watched as the bikers worked quickly, their faces serious, their movements precise. Hawk turned to her, offering a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. We're getting her to the hospital now, he said, his voice calm but firm. Aisha nodded, wiping her tear-streaked face with the back of her hand. Her heart was still racing, and the world around her felt like it was spinning out of control. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hawk's gaze softened for a moment, but he didn't say anything. He knew they didn't have time for words. The ride to the hospital was long, and the silence in the air was only broken by the rumbling of the engines. Aisha sat behind Hawk, gripping his jacket tightly as the cold night wind whipped past them. Her thoughts kept going back to her mother. Where was she? What happened? Why hadn't she come home last night? The questions swirled around in her head, unanswered and growing louder with every passing minute. After what felt like an eternity, the group finally reached the hospital. The bikers quickly unloaded Aisha's mother and rushed her inside, with Hawk and a few others following close behind. Aisha stayed outside, her eyes fixed on the hospital doors, praying for good news. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill inside her. She couldn't understand why this was happening, why her mother was in this condition. Just hours ago, everything had seemed normal. She had never imagined her night would turn into this. After what seemed like forever, Hawk finally emerged from the hospital doors, his face grim. He walked over to Aisha, who was standing by the bike, her hands shaking. She's stable, Hawk said, his voice low. They're going to take care of her. Aisha's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and Hawk caught her just in time. But there's something else, he continued, his tone serious. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes wide. What do you mean? Hawk hesitated for a moment before speaking. There are signs of something more going on here, Aisha. The doctors think she might have been drugged. Aisha's blood ran cold at the words. Drugged? By who? Hawk's jaw tightened. We don't know yet. But someone is definitely involved, and we'll find out who. You're safe now, Aisha. We're not going anywhere until we get to the bottom of this. The words offered some comfort, but Aisha's mind was still spinning. Who could have done this to her mom? Why would anyone hurt her? The questions kept coming, but no answers were in sight. As they sat in the quiet hospital lobby, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. Hawk and the others sat around, quietly strategizing their next move. There was no question in their minds that they were going to protect Aisha, no matter what. But the mystery of who was behind her mother's condition weighed heavily on them. No one said it, but they all knew this wasn't just a random act of violence. Something more sinister was at play. The next few hours passed slowly, but finally, they got the news. Aisha's mother had regained consciousness. The doctors were hopeful, but they were still concerned. Hawk, ever the leader, stood up as soon as he heard the news. Let's go, he said, his voice filled with determination. We're going to talk to her. Find out what happened. Aisha followed Hawk through the hospital corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached her mother's room, the door was slightly ajar. Hawk gave a small knock before stepping inside. Aisha's mother was lying in the bed, her face pale but awake. She looked weak, but there was a faint smile on her lips when she saw Aisha. Baby, she whispered, her voice hoarse. You're here. Aisha rushed to her side, taking her mother's hand in hers. Mom, I don't understand, she said, tears welling up in her eyes again. What happened? Why didn't you come home? Her mother took a deep breath before speaking. I don't know how to explain it, she said slowly. I was with someone I shouldn't have trusted. And they. She paused, struggling to speak. They hurt me, Aisha. Hawk stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Do you know who it was? Aisha's mother shook her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. No, but I think I know who they were working for. There's someone dangerous. The room grew tense as the realization set in. There was more to this than just a simple attack. And the bikers knew, without a doubt, they were dealing with something much darker than they had originally thought. As Aisha sat by her mother's bedside, her mind was racing. Every word her mother had spoken echoed in her ears. Someone dangerous. Someone they couldn't trust. The room felt colder now, despite the warm hospital air. The biker group had left briefly, giving Aisha and her mother a moment of privacy, but they were still nearby, just a call away. Hawk had made sure of that. Aisha could feel her heart pounding as she held her mother's hand tighter. Her thoughts went back to everything that had happened, the missing night, the silence, and the haunting suspicion that things were not as they seemed. Mom, who do you think did this? Aisha asked, her voice trembling as she searched her mother's eyes for answers. Her mother hesitated, her breath shallow as she tried to gather strength. There's someone in the neighborhood, a man I once knew, she whispered, her voice fragile. But it's been years. He used to be a part of something bad. Hawk had heard the faint words from the door as he entered the room, his face hardening. He moved to Aisha's side, his strong presence a silent reassurance. Do you remember anything about this man? Hawk asked gently, his eyes scanning Aisha's mother's face. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. His name is Derek. He's part of a gang. I thought he was gone for good, but he must have come back. He's the one who hurt me, and he's the one who's after you, Aisha. Aisha's eyes widened in disbelief. Derek? The name didn't mean anything to her. What do you mean, after me? She asked, confused. Her mother's eyes filled with fear as she struggled to explain. Derek, he's always had a way of getting what he wants. When I left him, he didn't take it well. He blamed me for everything. And now I'm afraid he's come for you, Aisha. You're in danger. Hawk clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the words. He wasn't just dealing with an ordinary man. Derek was dangerous, part of a gang that was known for violence and manipulation. We're going to protect you both, Hawk said firmly, turning to Aisha. We won't let anyone hurt you. We're going to take care of this. Aisha nodded, but the fear still lingered in her chest. Derek. The thought of someone who could hurt her mother like this made her stomach turn. What do we do now? She asked, looking at Hawk. We'll stay here until we know for sure that Derek isn't around. We'll need to figure out what his next move is, Hawk replied, his voice steady and commanding. The bikers had already started making plans, mapping out their next steps. Hawk didn't trust Derek's silence. It wasn't over yet, and the danger was far from gone. They had to stay vigilant. The hours stretched on, with Hawk's team checking every exit of the hospital, making sure no one approached. It was the quiet before the storm, and Hawk wasn't about to let his guard down. As the night wore on, Aisha's mother drifted in and out of consciousness, her condition stabilizing, but the fear in her eyes remained. She couldn't escape the past, and now, neither could they. Derek was coming for them, and they had to be ready. Hawk stood by the window, his eyes scanning the empty streets below. We'll have to leave soon, he muttered to himself, more to reassure his own nerves than anyone else. Once your mom is stable, we're getting out of here. Aisha's gaze never left her mother. And what about Derek? She asked quietly. Hawk turned to face her, his expression hard. We'll handle Derek. We always do. But we need to be smart. We need to think ahead. Outside the hospital, the sound of motorcycles revving up in the distance signaled the bikers were ready. They had been preparing for this moment since they had arrived. Hawk knew they needed a plan, a solid one, and it had to be executed perfectly. Derek couldn't be allowed to hurt anyone again. He had already caused too much pain, and the bikers weren't going to let it happen again. Just as Hawk was about to turn to make the call, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The message was short, but it sent a cold shiver down his spine. Derek's on the move. He knows you're here. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't wasting time. He turned to Aisha and her mother, his tone sharp. We're leaving. Now. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. What do we do? She asked, panic rising in her chest. Hawk took a deep breath, his voice low and steady. We get you to safety. Then we deal with Derek. The bikers moved quickly, getting everything ready. The hospital room felt colder now, the urgency in the air palpable. As the door closed behind them, Hawk gave a final glance at Aisha's mother. He wasn't going to let Derek hurt anyone else. Not on his watch. They would face Derek head-on, and they would win. This wasn't just about protecting Aisha. It was about ending this nightmare for good. The tension in the air was thick as Hawk and the rest of the bikers quickly gathered around their bikes, ready to move out. Aisha clung to her mother's side, trying to keep calm despite the fear that gripped her chest. She could feel the weight of what was about to happen, the uncertainty of whether Derek was already closing in on them. The hospital parking lot, usually a place of peace and quiet, now felt like a battleground. As the bikers fired up their engines, Hawk turned to Aisha, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We need to move fast. Derek's not going to wait. We're getting out of here, and we're going to keep you safe. Aisha nodded, though the knot in her stomach only grew tighter. But where will we go? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hawk met her gaze, his eyes sharp with determination. We've got a place. A safe house. It's not far, but we need to stay on the move. Without another word, Hawk and the others mounted their motorcycles, the low growl of the engines breaking the stillness of the night. The convoy of bikers rolled out of the hospital parking lot, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Aisha sat behind Hawk, holding onto him tightly as they sped through the city streets. The city was quiet, but Aisha knew that silence was only temporary. Derek was coming for them. The further they drove, the more Aisha's thoughts raced. Was Derek already here, watching them? Was he going to find them before they reached safety? Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every street corner felt like a potential ambush. She wanted to ask Hawk more questions, but she knew now wasn't the time. They had to stay focused. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Hawk signaled for the group to slow down. He glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind them. There was no sign of anyone following, but Hawk didn't trust it. Keep your eyes peeled, he instructed the bikers, his voice cutting through the radio. We don't know if Derek has anyone on our tail yet. The safe house was just a few miles away, nestled in the woods on the outskirts of town. Hawk had set it up a while ago, anticipating a situation like this. It was isolated enough that no one would think to look for them, but close enough to the city that they could get in and out quickly. As they approached the turnoff, Hawk slowed, signaling for the bikers to follow him off the main road. The gravel driveway leading up to the house was barely visible in the darkness, but Hawk knew the way by heart. He turned into the driveway, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires echoing in the night. The bikers pulled in behind him, and Hawk immediately dismounted, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We're here," he said, his voice low but clear. Aisha looked around as they unloaded, her heart still racing. The house was small, tucked away in the trees, with a porch that creaked in the wind. It looked like something out of a movie, hidden in plain sight. A safe place. A place that felt like it could offer some protection, at least for now. Hawk led them inside, where a few of the bikers were already setting up. They moved with a sense of purpose, quickly securing the house. It wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. There were weapons stashed in hidden compartments, and a small communications system to keep in contact with the rest of the crew. "Aisha, your mom's going to be okay," Hawk said, turning to the girl as she sat on the couch, her hands wringing nervously. "We've got everything under control. No one's going to hurt her again." Aisha nodded, but the fear was still there, hidden beneath the surface. She wasn't sure if she could believe Hawk. They had no idea where Derek was, or how far his reach went. She couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. As the hours ticked by, Hawk kept watch outside, keeping an eye on the perimeter. The rest of the bikers stayed alert, watching the house and ensuring no one would get past them unnoticed. They all knew that Derek's gang was ruthless, and it was only a matter of time before they came for them. The night passed slowly, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the house. Aisha's mother slept, her condition slowly improving, but the danger was far from over. Hawk and the others knew they needed to be ready for anything. As dawn began to break, Hawk gathered the group together. "We don't know how long we've got," he said, his tone serious. "We need to make sure Aisha and her mom are safe. Derek won't stop until he gets what he wants. And right now, that means us. We can't afford to wait." Aisha's stomach tightened as Hawk's words sank in. This was far from over, and Derek wasn't just going to walk away. The bikers had to face whatever came next, and Aisha had to trust that they could protect her, no matter what it took. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet yard. Hawk paced back and forth, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The wind rustled the leaves, but all Hawk could hear in his mind was the sound of Derek's gang closing in. He knew it wouldn't be long before they found the safe house. He had to act fast. Aisha sat by the window, her eyes fixed on her mother, who was still resting. The doctors had done all they could, and now it was up to them to keep her safe. Aisha's thoughts raced as she tried to process everything that had happened. Her life had turned upside down in the span of a few days. She had gone from living a normal life to being on the run from a dangerous gang, all because of someone her mother had once known. The man who had hurt her mother, the one named Derek, was still out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. Aisha shivered at the thought of him. She didn't know who he was, but the fear in her mother's voice told her everything she needed to know. She was terrified. And now, Aisha was too. Hawk turned to one of the bikers who had been watching the perimeter. "Any sign of movement?" he asked. The biker shook his head. "Nothing yet, but we're keeping an eye out. They'll be here soon. We should be ready." Hawk nodded. He knew the bikers were always prepared, but that didn't ease the tension in his chest. They were dealing with a dangerous group, and no one could predict what Derek's next move would be. "Let's get the plan in motion," Hawk said, his voice low but firm. "We're not taking any chances." He turned to Aisha, who was still sitting near the window. "Aisha, you stay here with your mom. We're going to make sure you're safe." Aisha nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't going to be safe anywhere. The bikers quickly spread out around the house, setting up defensive positions. They knew Derek would be coming soon, and they needed to be ready. Hawk checked his watch. It was just after 8 in the morning. They had maybe an hour, maybe less, before Derek and his gang showed up. The bikers were already prepping their bikes, making sure everything was in working order. Hawk was about to head outside to double-check the perimeter when Aisha's voice stopped him. "What if they find us?" she asked, her voice small and shaky. Hawk turned to face her, his expression softening. "We won't let them find you, Aisha," he said, his voice filled with reassurance. "You're not alone. We're all here for you. We'll make sure you and your mom get out of this." Aisha looked into his eyes, searching for the reassurance she so desperately needed. She nodded, trying to trust him, but doubts still lingered in her mind. She wanted to believe everything would be okay, but the reality of the situation was too overwhelming. Hawk stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face as he surveyed the area. The woods surrounding the safe house were dense, and the only way in or out was through the gravel road that led to the front of the property. Hawk had already ordered the bikers to block off the road, creating a makeshift barricade to slow down any potential attackers. He stood near the edge of the property, watching the tree line. His senses were on high alert. The waiting was the hardest part. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. The unmistakable roar of motorcycles echoed in the distance. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. Derek was here. Hawk quickly motioned for the bikers to get into position. They all mounted their bikes and revved their engines, ready for whatever was coming. Aisha's heart raced as the sound of the motorcycles grew louder. She turned to her mother, who was still lying in the bed, too weak to fully understand the danger they were in. Aisha squeezed her hand tightly, her own fear now escalating. The bikers took their positions, forming a defensive line around the house. Hawk stood at the front, his eyes scanning the road, waiting for Derek's gang to appear. And then, just as Hawk had feared, the first of the gang members emerged from the tree line. A black SUV, followed by several motorcycles, rumbled down the road. Hawk's hand tightened around the grip of his bike, ready for what was about to unfold. He had to protect Aisha. He had to protect her mother. "Get ready," Hawk said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The bikers all nodded, their faces serious as they prepared for the worst. The time had come. Derek and his gang were here, and they were ready to fight. Hawk knew this wasn't just about protecting Aisha and her mother anymore. This was about stopping Derek for good. It was time to take the fight to him. The black SUV and motorcycles came into view, rumbling down the gravel road, their engines a menacing sound that reverberated through the trees. Hawk's heart raced as he stood in position, his eyes locked on the approaching vehicles. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The bikers had already positioned themselves, forming a line around the house, ready for whatever was about to come. Aisha stood by the window, her eyes wide with fear, watching as the gang drew closer. She squeezed her mother's hand, her body shaking with the tension of the moment. Her mother, though still weak, managed to offer a faint smile, trying to reassure her daughter. But Aisha could see the fear in her eyes too. Hawk looked over at the group of bikers, each of them standing tall, their faces hardened with resolve. They were ready for a fight. Derek and his gang weren't going to take this property without a battle. The SUV came to a screeching halt just in front of the barricade the bikers had set up. The sound of the engine stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. Hawk could feel the weight of the moment in his chest. This was no longer just about protecting Aisha and her mother. This was about stopping Derek and his gang from causing any more damage. The doors of the SUV opened, and Derek stepped out, his presence as intimidating as ever. He was tall, with a dark expression on his face, his eyes scanning the bikers as he slowly made his way toward them. Behind him, several men on motorcycles dismounted, their leather jackets glinting in the dim light. The tension between the two groups was palpable. Hawk stepped forward, meeting Derek's gaze without flinching. "You've got no business here, Derek," Hawk said, his voice steady. Derek's lips twisted into a smirk, but his eyes were cold. "This is my business now, Hawk," he growled. "You and your crew don't get to hide behind this little house. It's time to settle the score." The bikers tightened their grips on their weapons, but Hawk held up a hand to stop them. "We're not looking for trouble, but we won't back down," Hawk said, his voice firm. "You'll leave this place, and you'll leave them alone. That's the only deal you're going to get." Derek laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You think you can stop me? You think I'll just walk away?" He motioned to his men. "Take them down." The bikers braced themselves as the gang members began to move forward, but Hawk and his crew were ready. The first biker lunged toward one of Derek's men, knocking him off balance. Another biker swung his fist, connecting with another man's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. A chaotic brawl erupted as the two groups clashed, fists flying, motorcycles revving, and the air filled with the sounds of shouts and the pounding of boots on the dirt. Aisha ducked behind the window, covering her ears from the sounds of the fighting outside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she prayed that her mother, still fragile, would stay safe. The fight outside was brutal. Derek's men were trained, but Hawk's crew had the advantage of being a tight-knit group, united in their mission to protect Aisha and her mother. As the brawl continued, Hawk kept his eyes locked on Derek, who was trying to push his way through the chaos. The two men finally faced each other, their eyes locked in a battle of wills. "You're outnumbered, Derek," Hawk said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave now, or you'll regret it." Derek smirked again, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew Hawk wasn't bluffing. "You think this is over?" Derek spat, his fists clenching. "This is just the beginning. You won't get away with this." But Hawk didn't flinch. "You've already lost," he said, his voice unwavering. "Go back to your crew and tell them this is over." Derek hesitated, his gaze shifting from Hawk to the defeated members of his gang. The battle had been quick, but decisive. Derek's men were sprawled out on the ground, groaning in pain. The bikers stood tall, victorious. Derek's face twisted in fury, but he knew when to retreat. With one last glare, he turned and motioned for his men to follow. They retreated to their motorcycles, leaving the safe house in defeat. As they drove away, the sound of their engines grew fainter, fading into the distance. Hawk stood still, his chest heaving with the adrenaline of the fight. He turned to the other bikers, nodding in silent approval. They had won, but the battle had taken its toll. Hawk made his way to the window where Aisha was standing, her eyes wide with relief. "It's over," Hawk said quietly, his voice calm. Aisha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging in relief. She turned to her mother, who was still lying on the couch, her eyes closed in exhaustion. "Are we safe now?" Aisha asked, her voice shaky. Hawk nodded. "For now, yes. But we'll stay alert. Derek won't give up so easily." Aisha looked out the window, watching as the dust from the battle slowly settled. Her heart was still racing, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of safety. They had fought back, and they had won. The sound of motorcycles fading into the distance signaled the retreat of Derek and his gang. The once tense atmosphere outside the safe house began to settle, but the sense of unease that had gripped Aisha's chest did not subside. She looked around at the bikers, who were now gathered near the porch, discussing their next move. They had won the battle, but Aisha knew that the war wasn't over. Hawk stood beside her, his expression calm but serious. "You're safe, Aisha," he said quietly, his voice filled with reassurance. "For now, anyway. But we can't let our guard down." Aisha nodded, though the relief she had felt moments ago was already beginning to fade. Derek had retreated, but she knew he would be back. The bikers had sent a strong message, but it had not been the final one. She could still hear the sound of Derek's voice in her head, telling her they weren't done. Hawk's words brought her back to the present. "We need to move your mom. It's not safe for her to stay here too long," he said. Aisha's eyes turned toward her mother, who was still resting in the room, her face pale but peaceful. She looked fragile, like she might break at any moment. "How is she?" Aisha asked softly, her worry not yet fully eased. "She's recovering," Hawk replied, his tone firm but kind. "But the longer we stay in one place, the more dangerous it becomes. We'll keep her safe. You just have to trust us." Aisha hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Trust wasn't easy when your whole world had been flipped upside down. But she had no other choice. She had to trust them. The bikers moved quickly, preparing the safe house for an imminent departure. Hawk had already made arrangements to move Aisha and her mother to another location, one that was even more secure. As they gathered their things, Aisha stood near the window, staring out into the woods. She could feel the weight of what had happened weighing heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't stop thinking about Derek, what he wanted, why he was after her and her mother. What had they done to deserve this? "Do you think he'll come back?" Aisha asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hawk looked at her, his expression hardening. "He'll be back, all right. But when he does, we'll be ready." His voice was low and full of resolve. He turned away to give the final orders to the bikers. Aisha turned back to her mother, still lying on the couch. Her mother's breathing was slow and steady, but Aisha knew that the road ahead would not be easy. As the bikers loaded their bikes and prepared to leave, Hawk motioned for Aisha to come over. "It's time," he said. "We'll get you both out of here." The ride to the new location was a tense one. Aisha stayed close to Hawk, her mother safely secured on one of the bikes behind another biker. The streets were quiet, but every mile felt like a countdown. Aisha kept her eyes on the road ahead, trying to push aside the thoughts of what might come next. They arrived at the new location before the sun had set, a secluded area deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was quiet here, far away from the chaos of the city. The bikers quickly secured the area, setting up a perimeter around the cabin. Hawk led Aisha and her mother inside. The cabin was small but sturdy, with thick walls that would protect them from any outside threats. It was a far cry from the luxury of a normal home, but it was safe. And that's all that mattered right now. As they settled in, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another temporary solution. They couldn't stay here forever. And Derek was still out there, somewhere. What happens now? Aisha asked, her voice full of uncertainty. Hawk looked at her, his expression calm. Now we wait. We make sure you and your mom are safe. And when Derek shows up again, we'll deal with him. Aisha nodded, though she couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. She had no idea what to expect next. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let Derek hurt her family again. She would fight with everything she had, just like the bikers had taught her. Hawk and the others gathered around a small table, discussing the next steps. They weren't just protecting Aisha and her mother anymore. They were preparing for the inevitable confrontation with Derek. And they had no intention of losing. As Aisha lay down on the couch next to her mother, she stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what was to come. She didn't know how long they would be safe in this cabin, but she knew one thing. Derek wasn't going to get the better of them. Not while the bikers were by their side. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Aisha sat on the worn couch, her eyes flicking between her mother and the bikers who were gathered around the small wooden table. They had set up a temporary safe house, but Aisha knew it was only a matter of time before Derek would come looking for them. Hawk had said they were ready, but Aisha still couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at her stomach. It had been a long, tense night. The bikers had been preparing for the worst, fortifying the cabin with whatever they could find. Hawk had told her it would be all right, that they were going to face Derek head-on when the time came. But Aisha wasn't so sure. What if they weren't ready? What if they failed? Her thoughts were interrupted as Hawk walked over, his face set with determination. "How's she doing?" he asked, referring to Aisha's mother, who was still resting, though her condition had improved since the last time Aisha had checked. "She's okay," Aisha replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's still sleeping, but she seems better. I just don't understand why this is happening. Why Derek? Why us?" Hawk sighed, sitting down next to her. "I wish I had an answer for you, Aisha. What I do know is that we're going to make sure he can't hurt you or your mom anymore. He won't get to keep coming after you. We're putting an end to this now." Aisha nodded, trying to take in his words. It was hard to believe, given the fear that had been building in her since Derek first appeared in their lives. As the day dragged on, the bikers remained on high alert. Hawk made sure everyone had a job, from securing the perimeter to preparing for a possible fight. They were ready, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind that Derek and his gang would be coming for them soon. Aisha couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She didn't want to bring this danger to the bikers. They had their own lives, their own families to protect. Yet, here they were, risking everything to keep her and her mother safe. "Why are you all helping us?" she asked softly, looking around at the bikers. "You don't owe us anything." Hawk turned to her, his gaze softening. "It's not about owing anyone anything. It's about loyalty. We protect our own, and right now, you and your mom are part of that. When you join a crew like ours, you're family. And we take care of family." Aisha felt a lump in her throat as his words sank in. She had never experienced loyalty like this before. It wasn't just about riding together, having fun, or fighting the law. The bikers had shown her that true loyalty meant stepping up for someone, even when it meant putting yourself in harm's way. As night fell again, the air grew colder. Hawk gathered everyone together, his voice low and serious. "Listen up," he began, his eyes scanning the group. "We've been on high alert since we got here. Derek will be coming, and we need to be ready. When he shows, we don't wait. We take the fight to him. We protect Aisha and her mother, no matter what." The group nodded in unison, their resolve firm. Hawk's voice took on a more personal tone as he turned to Aisha. "You've got my word. We'll make sure you both are safe, and we won't let him hurt anyone else." Aisha gave him a weak smile, trying to believe him. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about her or her mom anymore. Derek had crossed a line, and now it was personal for everyone. The bikers weren't just fighting for a family in need. They were fighting for justice. Hours passed in silence, with everyone keeping watch for any signs of movement. Aisha tried to sleep, but the constant buzzing of anxiety kept her awake. Her mind wouldn't stop running through the possibilities. What if Derek wasn't alone? What if they weren't ready? But despite her fears, a small part of her began to feel something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Maybe they could make it through this. Maybe the bikers could really stop Derek. As the hours wore on, Aisha's exhaustion finally overtook her. She closed her eyes and fell into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with shadows and the sound of engines roaring in the distance. When she awoke, it was still dark outside, but something felt different. The silence had shifted. Aisha sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sound of motorcycles approaching in the distance, unmistakable in the quiet of the night. She turned to Hawk, whose eyes were already fixed on the horizon. "It's time," he said softly, his voice filled with determination. Aisha stood up, her legs shaky as the adrenaline began to kick in. This was it. Derek was coming for them, and they were ready. Hawk gave her a final look of reassurance. "Stay close to me. We'll make sure you're safe." Aisha nodded, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. They were going to face Derek together, and they weren't backing down. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, the sound echoing through the trees. Aisha's heart pounded in her chest as she stood near the door of the cabin, watching the night sky, waiting for the moment they'd all been preparing for. Hawk and the other bikers stood alert, their expressions hard, their muscles tense. They all knew what was coming. Derek wasn't the type to back down, and he was not going to stop until he had what he wanted. Aisha could feel the weight of it. The danger, the uncertainty, the fear. It all hung heavy in the air. Her mind raced, and she thought about everything that had led up to this moment. The way her life had turned upside down, the fear she had seen in her mother's eyes, and now, the final confrontation. Was she really ready for this? Was anyone? Hawk looked at her from across the room, his eyes softening for a brief moment before he stepped forward. "Stay close to me, Aisha," he said, his voice steady, calm, as if everything depended on keeping their composure. "We'll get through this." Aisha nodded, though a knot formed in her stomach. She wanted to believe him, but the thought of facing Derek, facing whatever he was bringing with him, made her stomach churn. The bikers had set up a defense perimeter around the cabin, and everyone was in position, ready for action. There was no turning back now. "Stay low, stay quiet, and let us handle it," Hawk added, his gaze now scanning the horizon. Aisha looked at the other bikers, their faces set with determination. These people weren't just here to help. They were here because they believed in something bigger. They believed in protecting each other, and they would do whatever it took to keep Aisha and her mother safe. But she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was too deep, the waiting too long. She watched Hawk as he gave final orders to his crew, his voice low and commanding. There was a clear tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that made Aisha's skin crawl. She wished she could see what was going on outside, but she knew better than to move from her place. Hawk and his crew had the situation under control. At least, that's what they hoped. Then, the moment came. The bikes revved louder as Derek's gang finally arrived, their motorcycles roaring to life like an ominous storm. The sound of their engines filled the air, and Aisha's heart skipped a beat. Hawk turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "This is it," he said quietly. "Stay behind me." The first of Derek's men appeared through the trees, riding toward the cabin with a deliberate speed. Hawk took a deep breath, his body tense, ready for the fight. The bikers were lined up, their positions strong and firm, their eyes never leaving the approaching gang. Aisha could see the figures through the window, their silhouettes casting long shadows in the dim light. The tension in the air was thick, and she felt her palms begin to sweat. Her thoughts flashed back to everything her mother had said about Derek, the danger he posed, the past they had left behind, and now, here he was, coming to take what he thought was his. Hawk stepped forward, his stance firm. He didn't say a word as he prepared for the inevitable. Aisha watched him, trying to steady her own breathing. She had never seen Hawk like this before, so focused, so determined. His demeanor was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that told her he wasn't about to let anyone hurt her, her mother, or his crew. Derek's gang finally arrived in full force, their motorcycles pulling into view. The group dismounted, their leather jackets gleaming in the low light. Derek stepped forward, his eyes scanning the bikers, a sneer forming on his face. "You thought you could hide, Hawk?" Derek's voice rang out, filled with malice. "You can't run from me." Hawk's gaze locked with Derek's, his voice cold and measured. "This is where it ends, Derek," he said, stepping closer. "You leave now, and you never come back. That's your only option." Derek laughed, the sound cruel and harsh. "You think I'm just going to walk away? You've got no idea who you're dealing with." The gang members behind him shifted, eager for the fight, but Hawk's crew stood their ground. They weren't backing down. Aisha stood at the window, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She wanted to help, wanted to do something, but she knew her place. This wasn't her fight. It was up to Hawk and the others now. The standoff stretched on, the air thick with tension. Derek's men were waiting for a signal, and Hawk's crew was ready. Aisha could see the glint of metal as they all prepared for the worst. Then, without warning, Derek made a move. He lunged forward, his fist aimed directly at Hawk's face, but Hawk was faster. He sidestepped, grabbing Derek's arm and twisting it behind his back. The fight erupted in an instant. Aisha could hear the shouts, the sounds of fists hitting flesh, the clang of metal on metal. The bikers were in the thick of it, but they weren't alone. The group worked together, each biker backing up the other, their loyalty to each other stronger than anything Derek could throw at them. Aisha's heart raced as she pressed her palms against the window, watching the chaos unfold. She wanted to run out there, to help, but Hawk had told her to stay inside. "Please, be safe," she whispered to herself. As the battle raged on, Aisha's mind raced. She couldn't stay in the cabin forever. She had to believe that they could win, that Hawk and the others would be able to end this for good. The fight was long and brutal, but Hawk and his crew were relentless. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for their future, for their right to protect the ones they loved. As the dust began to settle, Aisha watched as the bikers slowly started to regain their footing. Derek's gang had been defeated. The danger was over, at least for now. But Aisha knew that Derek's words still echoed in her mind. This wasn't over. Not yet. The night was still, the silence only broken by the distant hum of the last motorcycles pulling away. Aisha's heart was still racing, her breath shallow as she watched the final moments of the fight unfold before her eyes. Derek's gang, once formidable, was now retreating, leaving behind a trail of dust and bruised egos. She could see Hawk, standing tall, his face set with determination, his body showing the signs of the battle, but not yielding an inch. He had won. They had won. But Aisha knew, deep down, that the victory was only temporary. Derek was out there, licking his wounds, and he wasn't the type to give up easily. Hawk turned towards the cabin, his eyes scanning the surroundings to make sure they were truly safe. He moved with a steady confidence that put Aisha's nerves at ease, if only for a moment. She stood up from where she had been sitting, her legs still shaky from the anxiety that had gripped her throughout the fight. Her mother was still asleep, but Aisha knew the danger wasn't over. "Are you all right?" Hawk asked, his voice calm, but with a note of concern as he approached her. Aisha nodded, though the weight of everything still hung over her. "I'm okay," she replied, her voice a little shakier than she'd intended. "What happens now?" Hawk looked over at her, his eyes hardening once more. "Now we wait. We clean up. And we prepare. Derek's not gone for good. We've got a small window, and we're taking it. But don't worry. He won't come back unless we let him." Aisha wasn't so sure. Derek had been relentless, and the idea that they could keep him away for long seemed almost impossible. Still, she appreciated the strength in Hawk's voice. He was their leader, their protector, and despite her doubts, she trusted him. As the bikers gathered around, there was a sense of finality in the air, but it was a fragile kind of peace. They had won this round, but Aisha knew there was more to come. "What about the others?" she asked, her gaze moving to the other bikers, who were now tending to their bikes and checking their equipment. "They're good," Hawk reassured her. "Tired but good. No one's hurt too badly." Aisha looked over at the others, noticing how they worked together, their movements seamless, as if they had done this countless times before. They had come through for her mother, and they had shown her something she had never experienced before: loyalty, trust, and protection. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about standing together when it mattered. Hawk turned back to her, his eyes softening just for a moment. "We'll keep you safe, Aisha. I won't let anyone hurt you or your mom again. That's a promise." Aisha looked at him, a sense of warmth spreading through her, despite everything. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time in days, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. But as Hawk and the others began to make preparations for their next steps, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The night wore on, and despite the victory, Aisha couldn't find peace. The cabin felt empty without the constant tension, but that emptiness was replaced by a nagging fear. She sat by the window again, her gaze fixed on the distant woods, her mind replaying every detail of the confrontation. Hawk had been right. Derek wouldn't give up. And if Derek was planning something, Aisha knew he wouldn't be the only one involved. She had heard the whispers about the gang, about their reach, and now, she realized, it was more than just Derek. It was an entire network of people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And Aisha was in the middle of it. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Hawk approached her, his expression serious once again. "Get some rest," he said. "We're moving out in a few hours. I've made arrangements. We can't stay here much longer. It's not safe." Aisha nodded, though the rest she needed felt out of reach. She knew the fight was far from over. But the bikers had given her something she had almost lost hope in: a chance. They had shown her that, even in the darkest of times, there was always something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, Aisha felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. Something that mattered. Hawk walked back toward the group, his mind already focused on their next move. But Aisha's thoughts lingered on what he had said. They weren't out of danger yet. Derek would be back, and this time, they needed to be ready. The battle had just begun. The morning light had just begun to creep through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin's worn floorboards. Aisha sat on the edge of the couch, staring out the window, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quiet. The night had been long, the tension in the air palpable as they waited for Derek's next move. Hawk had been right. There was no peace, no time to rest. Derek wasn't finished with them. And as much as Aisha tried to push the fear aside, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling deep in her stomach. Derek was coming for them, and this time, they would have to be ready. Hawk had gathered the bikers the moment the sun had risen, giving them their next set of instructions. They had already moved the bikes into positions around the perimeter of the cabin, securing the area. But Hawk knew it wouldn't be enough. Derek would find them, and when he did, there would be no room for hesitation. "We need to move out," Hawk had said the night before, his tone flat, matter of fact. "We can't stay here. Derek has too many eyes on us now." Aisha had barely slept, the weight of Hawk's words keeping her awake. She couldn't help but wonder if they were doing the right thing. Running wasn't a solution. It was just postponing the inevitable. But what else could they do? She was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about keeping her mother safe anymore. It was about survival. It was about the choices they made, the risks they took, and the consequences that followed. Hawk came into the room, his eyes scanning the small cabin. But when he saw Aisha, his expression softened. He knew how she felt. He could see it in her eyes. "You good?" he asked, his voice quieter than it had been. Aisha nodded, trying to find the words to explain the fear that gripped her. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. "I just feel like we're running. But for how long? How much longer before we're safe?" Hawk sat down beside her, his presence comforting, yet still strong. "You're right. Running doesn't solve everything. But sometimes, it's the only option we've got. We get to a safe house, we get your mom settled, and then we figure out how to deal with Derek. We'll take it step by step. I won't let him hurt you again." His words, though reassuring, only seemed to intensify her feelings. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely. She wasn't sure she trusted anyone anymore. But she had no choice. She had to believe him, or else they were all lost. As the bikers finished their preparations, the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. It was a waiting game now. They were all just waiting for Derek to make his move. The sound of engines roared outside as the bikers mounted their motorcycles, revving them to life. Hawk turned to Aisha once more before heading outside. "We're ready," he said, a brief look of determination crossing his face. Aisha followed him outside, her mother now resting in the cabin's small back room. She still hadn't fully recovered, but she was strong. Stronger than Aisha realized. As the group began to leave, Hawk motioned for Aisha to ride with him. She hesitated for a moment before nodding, stepping up to join him on his bike. The engines rumbled to life again, but this time, Aisha wasn't sure if she was ready for what lay ahead. The ride through the winding roads was quiet, but her mind never stopped. Every turn felt like it might be their last, every shadow a threat. She clung to Hawk's back, trying to ignore the fear that pulsed through her veins. The sun was climbing higher in the sky now, and as they moved further from the cabin, Aisha could see that the world felt different. The streets weren't as familiar as they once were. Every corner felt unfamiliar. Even the air seemed thicker, as though the world had changed overnight. Hawk's grip on the handlebars was firm, and his gaze was unflinching. He was leading them to a new safe house, a place where they could regroup and plan their next move. But Aisha knew it wouldn't be long before Derek and his gang caught up. The bikers had been trained to stay alert, to watch for any signs of trouble, but Aisha couldn't help but feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on her. As they turned down a narrow road leading into the woods, Hawk slowed down, signaling for the others to follow. The atmosphere had shifted. This place, hidden away in the trees, was meant to be their refuge, but Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. She could hear the sounds of her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, and the thoughts in her mind kept looping over and over. What if Derek found them here? What if they couldn't outrun him? The safe house was closer now, the trees closing in around them. Hawk gave her a reassuring look, though she could see the lines of worry in his face too. They were all pretending that this was just another day. But Aisha knew better. This was no ordinary day. They had been through too much already. And Derek would come for them again. The question was, how long could they keep running before they had to face him, once and for all? The cabin in the woods, nestled deep in the trees, was supposed to be a safe haven. But as Aisha stood at the window, looking out into the vast expanse of the darkening forest, she couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that loomed over them. Derek's gang might have retreated, but the tension in the air was palpable, and Aisha knew deep in her bones that the peace wouldn't last. Hawk had said it himself, Derek would come back. The question wasn't if, but when. The bikers had set up camp outside, maintaining a watchful eye on every movement, every sound that echoed in the woods. Aisha tried to settle, but her mind was in a whirlwind. Her mother was resting, still weak from the ordeal, but it wouldn't be long before she would have to face the reality of what had happened. Aisha had tried to shield her from the worst, but now the full weight of their situation was pressing down on them both. Hawk came inside, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on Aisha. "You doing all right?" he asked softly. His voice was calm, but Aisha could see the quiet determination in his eyes. He knew the danger hadn't passed. He was just waiting for the inevitable. "I'm okay," she replied, forcing a smile, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't okay. How could she be when everything she knew was falling apart? Her life was no longer her own. It had been claimed by fear, by the danger that Derek brought with him. The walls of the cabin, once a safe barrier, now felt like a trap. "I'm not sure I can keep running, Hawk," Aisha confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." Hawk walked over and sat next to her, his presence comforting but also filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. "I know. It's not easy," he said, his voice low. "But you have to trust me when I say we're not running forever. We're not running away, we're just buying time. Eventually, we'll take the fight to him." Aisha looked at him, her eyes searching for the truth in his words. Hawk was a man of action, someone who took charge without hesitation. But this fight, the fight against Derek, wasn't like anything they had faced before. Derek wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of everything Aisha had run from, her past, her fears, and now, her future. "You really think we can stop him?" Aisha asked, her voice filled with doubt. Hawk turned to her, his eyes steady. "I know we can," he said firmly. "We've been through too much to let someone like Derek control our lives. He may have the power, but we've got something stronger, each other." The room fell silent for a moment. Aisha taking in Hawk's words. She didn't know if she believed him, but something inside her shifted. Maybe it wasn't about believing in the fight. It was about believing in those who were willing to fight for you. And that, in itself, gave her something to hold on to. The bikers were ready. They had gathered their supplies, prepped their bikes, and made sure the perimeter around the cabin was secure. Hawk stood up, his movements precise and purposeful. We leave at first light. Get some rest. It's going to be a long ride. Aisha nodded, though her mind was still racing. How long could they keep moving? How much longer would it be before Derek made his next move? She couldn't push the thoughts away. They were always there, lingering in the back of her mind. The day came too quickly, the sun rising over the horizon as Hawk and the bikers prepared for what would come next. Aisha and her mother were loaded onto the bikes, their faces set with determination, though Aisha could see the exhaustion in her mother's eyes. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had no choice but to keep moving. As they rode, the wind whipping through her hair, Aisha couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. Derek would find them eventually, but they would be ready. They had no choice but to face him. As the miles stretched out before them, Aisha couldn't help but think back to the words Hawk had said. They were more than just a crew, they were family. And no matter what Derek threw at them, they would face it together. They would protect each other. They would survive. The sun was beginning to set again, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, when they finally reached a remote location deep in the hills. It was another safe house, a temporary refuge before the real confrontation. The bikers gathered together, their expressions grim but resolute. Hawk stepped forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the group. "This is it," he said. "We've bought ourselves some time, but Derek's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. It's time to end this." Aisha stood behind him, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the end of a story. The story of a fight, of survival, of the loyalty and strength that had brought them this far. They weren't going to run anymore. They were going to face Derek. And they were going to win. As the bikers prepared for the final showdown, Aisha felt something inside her shift. The fear was still there, but now there was something else. A quiet, steady resolve. She wasn't alone anymore. She had family. And together, they would fight for their future. Discover the intense and gripping world of Hell Angels stories as we dive deep into the lives of bikers who will stop at nothing to protect their own. In this tale of survival, loyalty, and danger, Aisha and her mother find themselves caught in a whirlwind of terror after crossing paths with a dangerous gang. As they seek refuge in a hidden safe house, the Hell Angels stories unfold, showcasing the unwavering determination and strength of those who ride together. With Derek and his ruthless gang closing in, the bikers must prepare for an epic showdown, one that will change everything. Along the way, Aisha learns the true meaning of family and loyalty, as the Hell Angels stories reveal how these men and women risk everything to protect those they love. From the first clash to the final confrontation, these stories paint a picture of what it truly means to be a part of something bigger, and how far the Hell Angels will go to ensure their own survival. As the battle rages on, Aisha's journey of discovery continues, ultimately finding the strength to stand tall in the face of overwhelming odds. The Hell Angels stories are far from over, and with every twist and turn, they become even more powerful and unforgettable.